If you feel drained by the weight of the world, grieving dreams unfulfilled, unsure how to balance caring for yourself and caring for your community, or wondering if your efforts even matter anymore, then I have an invitation for you. For 13 years, I have walked alongside changemakers, helping my clients to heal burnout, find clarity, and realign to what matters most. And this past year has convinced me that the practices that I teach are more needed now than ever before. That's why I'm excited to invite you to join me for my free upcoming New Year's Hope and Clarity mini retreat. Over 3 days, we'll explore how to find hope and faith even when the odds are not in our favor, how to identify the core values that will keep you steady through the uncertainty in the upcoming year, and choose small, meaningful actions that nourish your heart and align with your values over and over again. If you long for more nourishment, steadiness, and clarity as you head into the year ahead, I hope that you'll join me. To learn more and to sign up, go to callingsencourage.com and then scroll down on the homepage. You'll see information for how to join me there. When we look at the state of waning democracy and rising authoritarianism in the US and throughout the world, it can be really hard to know what to do. Yeah, we can attend rallies and boycott companies that support authoritarianism and vote in local elections, but these actions can feel small compared to the federal government's incessant violence. So, what are we to do? My podcast guest this week, Jiva Manske, shares his response to this question. We undermine authoritarianism by building and organizing in community. Jiva Manske has been organizing since he was 12 years old. He is now a strategist, partner, and dad who works with people around the world to build powerful transformational movements. As director of strategic initiatives for the 22nd Century Initiative, Jiva works to build a more resilient, innovative, and aligned pro democracy field. He grounds his approach in commitments to accountability through collective action, organizing led by those most impacted by injustice, and healing centered practice. In our episode today, Jiva shares practical steps that we each can take now to grow democracy close to home. This conversation with Jiva feels like one of the most necessary, important conversations that I've had in a long time. And I frankly want everyone who cares about democracy to hear this one. So if you know people who need to listen to it, please share this with them. I hope so much that you enjoy. What called you to focus your work on organizing against authoritarianism and for real democracy?
Yeah, thanks for that question and thanks for having me. Really looking forward to it. My first experience with any kind of organizing or advocacy, I think, was I was 12 or 13 years old, and my mom brought me to DC with an advocacy group that she was part of to talk to members of Congress about strategies to end global poverty. And I was a super shy kid, had a hard time speaking up in class or had my small group of friends. And so the idea of like walking into a senator's office and saying something meaningful was super scary. But my mom and the group had really prepared me with the one thing that I was there to say, and it ended up going really well. So that wasn't the last time that I had the experience of working with a group of people, and that group of people helped me to overcome some of my shyness and giving me a sense that my voice matters. It also wasn't the last time I was part of a winning campaign, but really meaningful time. And so, but really both of my parents and my whole family has been committed to social change. I'm committed to nonviolence. My parents were mediators, restorative justice practitioners for over 20 years of my adult life. But both my parents were nonviolent communication trainers. And I mentioned my mom, but also just to mention my dad, who had a huge influence over me, really the embodiment of warmth and love and peace in my life, and showed me what it looked like, not only to really have an orientation to meeting needs, but meeting needs on a massive scale, and building community on a massive scale. He passed away really suddenly at the end of last year. And that was just as I was stepping into this job. And so I had this sense that a lot of my kind of career paths were coming together, but also this was this really kind of sweet chance to work with him in some ways. And so, you know, his ongoing presence in many ways of my life is about me kind of committing and recommitting to work with purpose and with integrity. And so I've had the chance to work in social change rooted in social justice and racial justice, economic justice for almost 20 years now. Often with that kind of work, we pick an issue or we're part of a mission-driven organization that's pretty issue specific. And we run campaigns to change specific policies and that kind of thing. And so for me, that's meant organizing under the banner of human rights, to end the death penalty, to defend immigrant rights, to expand access to justice for women and queer folks, to protect the environment, to prevent the violence of policing, a lot of those kinds of issues. But this moment right now really calls me and calls us, I think, to reckon with the fact that that model of working on individual issues has not really worked. And I think in some ways, in many ways, for me, this is a moment to actually reckon with how change is actually made. And so, you know, right now, that's what the fight is about. There's a small group of billionaires, mostly men, mostly Christian, mostly white, who think that change should happen because of their thought, at their whim, that that's how change should happen in our country and around the world. And on the flip side of that, there are those of us who believe that people should have a say over.
Can I pause you for a sec?
Yeah.
I just I want to pause before going into all of that. I just want to, as you start talking about how we need to be together, like,
Mhm.
I just want to share that as I hear about your dad passing at the end of last year, I just feel so much tenderness. I know you have a little child, and having that happen before this year started and before this job of yours started, I just want to say I have a lot of tenderness that comes up as I hear you sharing.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's a big time of life. I think this stage of life in general, of having aging parents and having young kids, there's a lot to be with around what it means to be in this world. And so that's been a lot of my family life and my community here. And I do think that part of it is reckoning with what's happening in the rest of the world, because that's in our feeds, that's in our neighborhoods, it's everywhere. I think it's all connected. I think so I appreciate you naming that. The way that I was raised, the ways that I continue to be kind of in community with family, chosen and otherwise, and the way that I parent, is all mixed up in kind of what calls me to be in this moment, committed to creating the possibility, the real possibility of being able to fight for the things that we really care about, for the dignity of everybody.
Yeah. And just the being togetherness of family and community. And Grace Lee Boggs used to ask this question of what time is it on the clock of the world? So before we dive deeper into the being togetherness that's required of these times, can you orient us a bit?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I appreciate the calling in of Grace Lee Boggs too. This is a person who had a long lifetime commitment to social and racial justice, to Black power in particular, which I think
Yeah.
is important to name. She died at 100 and was like on a picket line that very year. She really was committed in a lot of ways. And one of the things that she also called for was for visionary organizers. These are the folks that, when times of crisis, we respond in many different potential ways. Some people pull back, some people freeze, some people run away, and some people find creative ways to meet needs. And so that's this what time it is in some ways is a time for visionary organizers, a time for people to move beyond protest and to take massive collective action in ways that actually meets needs. And so, that's not easy to do in any time. But right now, in terms of the clock of democracy, it's close to midnight. And I think it's really important to understand that for anybody who cares about the idea of people power, the clock is ticking pretty rapidly. Right now, over 70% of people on the planet live under some form of autocracy. From looking at other countries and this one, you can see that there are patterns in how authoritarianism grows. First, there's a period of an attempted breakthrough, and then there's a breakthrough, and then there's consolidation. All three of those things have happened here in the US over the last 5 years. An attempted breakthrough, January 6th, 2021, an actual breakthrough in the last election. And so that puts us squarely in this consolidation phase, which the research shows that we have between 12 and 18 months before authoritarians consolidate power. And then the other context here in the US is that it appears to be moving even faster than that, which in many ways kind of makes sense because our history is actually full of authoritarianism. In fact, the Jim Crow South was the blueprint for Nazi Germany. And so if you talk to Black folks, Indigenous folks, disabled folks, trans folks, it's clear that authoritarianism is already here in a lot of ways. Like I said, all of that is true in terms of what time it is, but also to just land on it's a time for us to organize. It's a time for us to be together. It's time for us to recognize that there's actually not any kind of going back. Like we don't want to go back to the Biden era or Obama era democracy, right? We don't want to go back to a system that is built on harmful institutions. So right now is a time to build new institutions. It's a time for active solidarity with each other, for active solidarity with those who are most targeted. For folks who know something about conflict, for conflict workers, this is a time to really leverage those skill sets. We know how to be in uncertainty, and we know how to be in uncertainty with purpose. We know how to build transcendent solutions that meet all needs, right? And so this is really a time to lean in, to listen to the folks who have been trying to build transformation for generations. So listen to Black folks, listen to women, listen to queer folks, roll up our sleeves and get to work.
When you mention visionary organizers, there's a part of me that feels really pulled to be like, okay, how do we imagine? And I want to name that and share that I did a episode with Desiree Adaway, a Black teacher, consultant, coach who does really phenomenal work on imagination. So for folks who are like, ooh, how do I do that? I would reference that. And for actually doing the organizing work of creating these new institutions, that's what I want to focus on with you. To build the new institutions that we want, we need to bring people in that direction. And there's a couple of frameworks or metaphors that I've heard you share that I want folks to have at this right now in the conversation. So the first is spectrums of political engagement or allyship. And I think this one is so helpful for talking about so often folks on the left will be like, oh, you're not progressive enough. You're not radical enough. I can't be in relationship with you. But this spectrum, I think, paints a really poignant picture of why we need to not be doing that and of why it's so important to not throw people away and to focus on bringing people in. So can you share that spectrum for folks?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The spectrum of engagement or spectrum of allies, as a lot of trainers and others talk about it, is first and foremost an action orientation. So it's a tool that can help us plan the ways that we want to intervene in conflict on a collective scale. The basic idea of it is that we want to intervene in ways that support people to come closer to working with us to build the possibility of more collective action. The spectrum itself is on one side, we have our active allies, the people who are most actively engaged. And so these are the people who are already working on an issue. These are people who are already in it deeply and maybe have been for a long time. We don't have to ask, right? Like they're there with us. And then just next to them are passive allies or more passively engaged folks. And so these are people who share our values. These are people who might, say the right things or say things that are aligned with what we are working towards. They might show up a little bit, but they're not as actively engaged. They're not necessarily leading the charge. Just next to them are neutral folks. So people who often are neutral on the spectrum are people who just aren't thinking about it, right? Like who might actually share a lot of our values, who might say yes if we just ask them. But it's folks who maybe for whatever reason aren't thinking about, aren't feeling the things that we're feeling as we're fighting for justice, as we're organizing for change, as we're trying to build a different kind of world. So that's the kind of first part of the spectrum. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have passive opponents. We have people who maybe aren't with us, but aren't doing much about it. They might be posting on the internet. They might be voting a way that we don't like, but they're not necessarily actively doing anything to directly harm people. And then on the far end of the spectrum are our active opponents. And I think it is important. I think it's hard sometimes for those of us who are trained in conflict transformation like me to actually name anybody as an opponent, right? Like we believe pretty deeply that what we're here to do is for everybody. And I think that's really important to hold. And I think it's also important to name that there are people who are actively engaged in a project that's opposed to one that includes a world where everybody's dignity matters, where everybody's liberation matters, right? And so I think those pieces are really important to kind of name. And so the idea of the spectrum of allies or spectrum of engagement is that we actually want to isolate those actual opponents with our action. And we want to try to move everybody closer to us. We want to make the passive opponents neutral. We don't need to move them all the way to our side, but maybe we want them to not speak up so much.
Mhm.
With the neutral folks, we don't need them to dive all the way in, but we do want them to start considering that they might be part of something bigger than themselves, that they might be connected to the possibility of change. And with our passive allies, we actually do want them to dig in. So that's also a spectrum of our energy, right? Like there are some people that we're not going to persuade. There are some people that we're not going to move to our side through our actions or our words. And there are some people who, with a different experience, with a different example, are going to move. And so I think that's kind of a helpful lens to see things through. And I think there's more to say about that or in terms of how to design action that actually lifts up conflict into people's imagination. But I can stop there just with this tool because I think it helps us to just have a sense of how to move with people.
Earlier, you were talking about how issue-based politics has not been effective. And it makes me think about how this shows up in my community and thinking about there's a city councilor, maybe the only city councilor who voted for Trump. And we will disagree on many issues, but there are many that he has actually been the champion for, like bringing forth the proposal to fund the schools, right? There's a part of being on the spectrum and playing with the spectrum is seeing people in their complexity. And I've seen him, because of the rapport that the many of us on council have established with him and that relationship, I can be like, hey, at the last city council meeting afterward, I'm like, I am supporting the trans person who's running against you for city council. And just so you know, like, I appreciate you. And if you win, we're going to continue to be in relationship. Anyway, the seeing people in their complexity and not
Totally.
pushing that there's like that reflexive, oh, you're not as radical as I am. If that had happened, he may not have brought forward the proposal to fund the schools, for example.
Totally. Totally. And I think that complexity is really important to name. I think the way that the political paradigm has been changed over the last 10 years or so by the MAGA political machine is to make polarization a key political tool, to make us think that everything is binary, this side or that side, to always blame the other side as a way of riling up our side. And that's a political paradigm shift. When we name it that way, it helps us to then figure out how to engage differently. And I think we can also be part of political paradigm shift in a different direction. I don't think we have to look far to see that that's already happening. I think your example is a really helpful and important one. I think there's tons of other examples for listeners, even to just think about the folks in your life, the folks in your family, right? Like the strategies that you use to connect with people across difference all the time. We rarely agree with every single person all the time. And so we're constantly moving through some form of conflict. And the kind of political and even cultural paradigm shift that I'd like to be part of, and I think we are a part of, is to make conflict generative, to keep needs at the center and not necessarily winning at the center. And I actually think that when we do keep needs at the center like that, we do win. To your point, right? We can get folks to support the things that we know will actually meet needs in our communities. So I think that's a really helpful and important thing to name, just the complexity of each person. Nobody falls on that spectrum that I mentioned. Nobody falls squarely in one of those buckets all the time on everything. Often in the training room with any kind of change work, we like to apply these frameworks as if they are our real life. One of the things my dad often said was that the map is not the territory.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things. It's a helpful tool for assessing how we want to intervene in action, how we want to design an action that actually brings people to our side, that actually supports people to see that an issue is important, to feel like they are part of something, to build a sense of belonging, all those kinds of things. And it's really fluid, like everything, right? It's not like finally they're with us and we lived happily ever after. No, it's like we're human and we're community, we're collective, and those are complex relationships to navigate.
I also think about the complexity of polarization. Like, I remember I came up during the war in Iraq, and I remember like the Democrats and Republicans are all the same. And, everyone was moderate-ish and not doing anything but going along with Bush. And there has been a part of me that's like, well, actually, like I feel so many more people are on my side now. And I know that there's a lot of debate over the value of polarization or not in organizing.
Yeah.
Any immediate thoughts about that you want to share?
Yeah, totally. I mean, one thing to understand about this period of authoritarian consolidation is that authoritarians and their active supporters need us to be divided from each other, right? They need us to be at each other's throats so that we're not actively engaging their project, which is to leverage repression, political violence. There's a whole playbook that authoritarians follow here, and they are following it, and they need us to not be in the way. So the ways that repression or political violence or any of that works in times like this is that it happens in really cyclical ways. So you can see what's happening in Chicago right now as we're recording, where at the end of August, there was an announcement that the National Guard was going to be deployed. Community immediately organized in many different ways. They organized everything from active campaigns to make sure that the mayor and the city council and other elected and city officials were all going to present a united front. There were folks who organized community safety, who organized mutual aid hubs throughout the city. Every day there were ICE raids that were brutalizing people. And each time one of those things happened, they organized around it. It's how the cycle of violence or the cycle of authoritarian consolidation actually works, is that waves of repression, waves of political violence kind of come through. And if we can respond to those in a way that actually brings people in, and that sometimes includes exposing what's happening, often it includes humanizing the people who are actually targeted and being in active solidarity with them. It often means kind of countering mis and disinformation. And it always means kind of doubling down with being in community with each other and showing solidarity with each other. And so I think that's how the kind of polarization and its antidote work together, is that the kind of forces of polarization, which are those cycles of violence that authoritarians want to leverage to keep us afraid, to keep us divided from each other, to keep us silent, that when that happens, we actually grow stronger. We actually find ways to bring more people in, and for in really meaningful ways. And so that doesn't mean everybody is in the streets all the time. It doesn't mean that everybody is putting their body between an ICE agent and a community member, but it does mean that we find ways for everybody to plug in. And so I think in many ways the antidote to polarization is collective action. And on a really micro scale, like if we're at family dinner, the holidays coming up, that's a thing that's going to happen. We find ways to actually meet people in the complexity. And when polarization comes up, we know how to de-escalate that. We know how to connect on the things that we care about. And my experience working with more conservative folks for most of my career and most of my life is that when you both meet people where they are and you're really unapologetic, like really clear about what your values are, I'm really clear that there is room for you in this.
My dear friend yesterday just told me that she started reading Loretta Ross's new book about calling in, and she was like, "Oh my goodness." She said, Loretta Ross said, "Dissent is not betrayal." One of the things that I find the hardest is when colleague comrades are saying things about other people in town who are complex. And, it can be hard not to slide into demonization of other people. But what I often find hard is when other folks are demonizing. And I'm curious if you have any suggestions about what to say in moments like that in a way that can be heard when we see other people sliding into pushing people back along the spectrum or demonization.
Yeah, it's a good question and a hard question. One is that I don't think that what you just named of like reaching to people who are demonizing or pushing people away or who are angry at other folks, I don't think it's everybody's work to work with those people. And so I think that's one kind of question to ask yourself is like, is this actually my work to do? And I think about, for example, all of the Black folks who have been kind of clamoring about racial justice for a long, like for their whole lives and for the generations before them, who are exhausted from educating people about why XYZ is a thing, that we don't necessarily ask those folks to be the envoys to our like angry white friends who are maybe doing and saying things that are actually fracturing some of our coalition or those kinds of things. So I think that's one piece is just to like ask ourselves, is this actually my work to do? And then I think the other thing is to do our own inner work to try to understand where that person might be coming from if they are demonized or polarizing. I think for those of us, yeah, who think of themselves as progressive, this is a moment where people are feeling more afraid than they ever have. So I think it's important to ground ourselves in that understanding as we prep to engage other people. That's the empathy piece of if it is my work to do this, then let's try to have a sense of where this person might be coming from. Third part of the work is to help people who have never experienced being targeted on someone's list, right? All these things that people are experiencing for the first time to help them understand that this has happened before, right? Like that this is not a new like this the conditions that we're in didn't start in January of this year. They didn't start in November of last year. And again, I keep on referencing my dad today. It's his birthday coming up. And so thinking about him, but he added this piece to the nonviolent communication 4-step model that he called the 0 step. And so it's all the things that we do before we do the observation, feeling, need, request thing in NVC. And that 0 step is all of that inner work that we need to do to actually know what we're here to do. What is our actual intention? Our intention is to connect. Our intention is to contribute, have a sense of where that other person might be coming from and what they are responding to, the fear in their system, the anger in their system, the grief in their system, each of those kinds of things. And then like, what's the actual truth here? Like, what is the actual situation here? What is it that we're trying to do? And so then as we enter a conversation, we're able to be both really clear about shaping it in a way that supports people to take actually effective action, because railing against each other is actually not that effective most of the time, especially when it obscures who our actual opponents are. Being really clear and standing in our truth as we're talking to folks, to be able to name the history of violence and injustice that has led to this moment, the ways that strategic coalition building and action is important, and being able to listen in ways that support people to feel understood, or all of those kinds of things that then help us to move forward together in ways that are actually strategic.
Yeah, I really appreciate the acknowledgement of fear. I know that for me personally, I'm well acquainted with rage. I've done a lot of work around grief. And it's like in the last couple of months, the acknowledgement of the fear and
Mhm.
how, like, of course, we feel so much fear. And of course, we get reactive in the fear. And in that zero step of acknowledging what's going on within us first, if we can give acknowledgement to the fear that we have, I find it so much easier to give acknowledgement to the fear that other people are holding as well.
Totally, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and fear is so hard to move through. And we are afraid on top of being kind of over activated a lot of the time. I mean, how often do we move from one meeting to the next meeting, or move from one engagement to looking at our feed on our phone, or spending any time scrolling, right? Each of those things that we see is an activation. And what isn't happening in that cycle is letting our whole system actually rest a little bit, letting ourselves actually hit some kind of threshold that supports us to be in a more organized state to begin with. And then you add very real threat to the environment that we're in. And so fear makes a ton of sense. And part of what it looks like to take action from a fearful state is that it can be fairly unconscious, right? I remember the first time that I was actively confronted by a line of militarized police at a protest. This was in Ferguson during the uprising that was happening there. And it was late at night. There were a few people on the street, mostly kids riding bikes, and small groups of people congregated on different corners. There was this McDonald's that a lot of people stood in the parking lot there and hung out, planned, but mostly connected. And there was this line of police officers with their shields and their batons and their helmets and that kind of thing. All of them at the same time put their visors down on their helmets and put their shields in front of them. It seemed like the line of them got a little taller, and they were kind of on the side, on the curb, on the sidewalk of the street, and they swung around so that they were all across the street. I had been on the side they would have been facing, and then all of a sudden, I was behind the line. My body moved me and the person I was with to the other side before I consciously could
Yeah.
take an action. So fear in that sense is actually really protective, right? It's really helpful. But what ended up happening is those officers, fired rubber bullets into that crowd. They arrested people with very little warning. It was a pretty aggressive and scary time, but I was safe. And so I think that kind of time moment is really real. Like that kind of fear and the way that our system is set up to move in that time is to keep us safe, is to help
Yeah.
us survive, right? And sometimes in this current moment, while threat is bigger for many of us, for many people, it might be the first time that we're experiencing this kind of possibility of being targeted. Fear is sometimes still misattuned or maladaptive to the state that we're in, right? So if I'm sitting in my office where I am right now,
Yeah.
I'm feeling afraid, even though the sky is blue outside and there's like nobody on the streets. There's like a school right down the street, right? Like I see some cars going past and those kinds of things, and I'm responding to whatever's in front of me from fear. That's actually a maladaptive response, right? So
Yeah.
to be able to do the kind of inner work, and we can't do that alone, right? Like doing that work with other people to be able to find ground and then respond in these kinds of moments actually helps us respond more clearly when the threat is there, when the threat is right in front of us.
Yeah, thank goodness for fear and how it protects us. Thank goodness that it protected you in that moment. And if we can, the medicine I think right now is grace, like having grace for ourselves and why we react in these ways, having grace for the moments where we are sitting in the living room and the fear is there and being able to offer grace to that fear can help to soothe it and having grace for each other and we are going to react in ways that we later wish that we hadn't and that will help us move through. I wonder what other key practices do you rely on or do you recommend that folks rely on when we do react in ways that we wish we hadn't, when other people react in ways that we wish they hadn't, when the conflicts come up and the challenging dynamics come up, what practices have you learned to rely on?
Yeah. You know, as a parent, there is abundant opportunity to practice.
Mhm.
Um, as a family, both my partner and I have come from traditions of conflict where of working with groups of people, of, all kinds of these things that we think should prepare us for being able to stay organized in hard times, right? And we both also knew that having a newborn, having an infant, having a toddler, like it's going to test us. And so one of the things that's been really helpful for me to kind of remember, which is kind of less of the practice itself, but it's certainly a bit of a foundation to kind of fall back on, is that, if part of my role as a parent is to build healthy attachment in my kiddo, then what actually builds healthy attachment? It's not actually getting it right every time. It's actually having a commitment to repair. And so, I think we can bring that into so much of our social change work, for example, that for those of us who have any kind of positional power, any kind of privilege, for those of us in white bodies, for those of us who are cis, gendered, those of us who have access to generational wealth or, can pay our mortgages or whatever it is, that when we are in relationship with other people, part of our job is to build healthy attachment, especially with people who don't have those kinds of positions. And so it is on us to be committed to repair.
What comes up for me when I hear you say healthy attachment? Healthy attachment can be defined in a lot of ways, but one way that I think about it is the ability to trust ourselves and others. It makes me think of a instance right after Trump was elected the first time, and I was organizing in collaboration with a local worker center, and people responded to me saying that I was doing things that were racist. And later, like years later, they apologized in a really genuine way. But in the moment, I had tears that came up. I was like, is it me? Is it them? I felt very confusing. But what helped me make sense of that is talking with a white colleague who was organizing with me, also in the same situation, was also being called out. And he said, Catherine, we have so many privileges as white people. Assuming trust of folks of color is not one of them, right?
Yeah.
Our job is not to take things personally, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think a real key to that experience and that story too is that you didn't do it alone, right? We are in relationship with other people, and that those relationships, our community around us, is where accountability lives. So, accountability and repair kind of go hand in hand. And accountability is a relationship. It's not anything other than that. It's not punishment. It's not isolated individual pain. It's not feeling pain, right? Accountability is actively learning, actively changing. It sometimes includes apology, it sometimes includes these things, but all of those are relational experiences. And so the experience of whether it's being called out, being called in, finding out in other ways that you might have messed up, any of that kind of stuff, it's really hard to just move through that by yourself and come out the other side with a commitment to repair. So I think that's a big, big part of it, is that we have to have people around us. We have to, and we all have people that we go to when we're in need, right? Or we have people who show up for us. So even getting clear about who that that pod is, as some folks in the transformative justice world would say, is like map who your people are, right? Who are the people that show up for you when you need that kind of accountability? So I think that is a big piece of how to move in this time and have a commitment to repair. I think one more thing that I would add to this is about grief, that, we all have experienced loss in our lives. I've named that this acute grief that's been moving through me in this conversation. But I think each time we witness brutal images on our social media feed or on another screen, whether it's people being killed in Gaza or people in DC or Chicago or LA being arrested, kidnapped by ICE. Like each of those is a loss. And so I think for many of us, kind of across cultures in the United States, being with grief isn't necessarily a norm. And I think especially in organizing, especially in social movement kind of space, the ethos is often like, pick yourself up and get back to work. And each time we do that without moving through grief in an effective way, in a compassionate way, in a wise way, we miss out. Like it's really important to feel grief when it shows up. And we can seek comfort and solace, right? We can bring people around us who can help us feel some comfort, feel some sense of return to ourselves or becoming of who we are becoming. And then I think it's really important to find inspiration, right? That idea of how to move through grief I got from Malkia Devich-Cyril, who's this brilliant Black feminist narrative strategist who has written a lot about grief and social movements. And it's been so helpful, not just with the big kind of acute losses that are closest to us in our lives, which we've all experienced over the last few years, but also with the things that seem like they might be smaller because they're just on our phone screen or something like that, with really, really addressing that well of grief and then acting from a place of grounded grief makes us more powerful.
So you were sharing earlier about growing up as your parents' kid and your rootedness in nonviolence. And you just shared the need for inspiration and grounded grief. And so that brings me to curiosity about the nonviolent strategic approach.
Mhm.
Can you share about that?
Yeah, and sometimes people struggle with the idea of nonviolence or nonviolent action. In many ways, the core of democracy, which is really about people power, like that's actually what the word means, is nonviolent action. And whether that is voting or whether that's negotiation, persuasion, right? Like each of those has a nonviolent action kind of core to it as we have to engage a system that is powerful, right? Whether it's a representative democracy that we've experienced, where decision-making power is concentrated in elected officials, or an authoritarian system where decision-making power is concentrated in a small group of people, the way that we influence that system is most often nonviolent anyway. I think it's important to recognize that for some of us, we might have a deep moral commitment to nonviolence, and that's not for everybody. That's okay. And nonviolent action is a pragmatic choice. I think it's important to name that. One of the memes of the last few months is this idea that 3.5% of the population taking action is enough to topple a king. And that number is pretty squishy, just to name that up front. But the point is that we don't actually need everybody. And pragmatically, what it means is that when there is a nonviolent civil resistance movement in a country that is either facing authoritarianism or has an active authoritarian government, the odds of shifting the dynamic back towards democracy increase dramatically when there's an active nonviolent civil resistance movement. And by dramatically, I mean like without a civil resistance movement, we have less than a 10% chance. Whereas with a civil resistance movement, we have over 50% chance in the short term. And so I think having that picture is a helpful kind of frame for understanding the pragmatism of nonviolent action. I think the other pieces just to kind of name in this is like the non in nonviolence isn't isn't just not violent, right? Just like the anti and anti-authoritarian isn't just not authoritarian. It's an active stance. So the non and nonviolence or non-cooperation is actually about taking collective action that denies the possibility of violence and denies the possibility of domination. So when I think about nonviolent action, when I think about strategic nonviolent action, I think about collective action that is designed in a way that, like we talked about earlier, moves people closer to our side. Nonviolent action actually empowers our participation advantage on the side of justice, on the side of dignity, on the side of freedom. It creates the possibility for many different lanes for people to be in, many different ways for people to plug in. With violent intervention, with violent responses, our options are super limited. And the people who are willing or able to do those kinds of things is a super small number of people. And so that's not a practical or pragmatic choice, especially when we're up against huge power and domination. And so to take action in really concrete ways that actually build our participation advantage, that's actually building our power. And so that's where the commitment to strategic nonviolent action is really important. But I think at least having that in mind and then finding ways to plug in with whether it's our local mutual aid efforts or campaigns that are building kind of beyond just the protests that are happening. Certainly join the protests too, right? But what are the ways that people are plugging in after that? What are the ways that people are doing the work of meeting needs in community? That's all strategic nonviolent action.
I became politicized learning about US foreign policy and Central America as a high schooler. And always said, like, I am not going to hold a moral commitment to pacifism. I don't know what tactics they should choose, but we will never have more guns. It'll never be the strategic approach. And you talk about pillars of power. I think that that metaphor is so important for people to think about what is the work of these times? How are we dismantling the pillars of power that could uphold authoritarianism? I
Yeah.
would share that.
You could imagine the governance system as the roof of a house. And that roof is then held up by pillars. Those pillars of support for a system often include business or security forces, police, ICE right now. It includes faith communities. It includes military families, veterans. It includes unions, civic associations. Each of those pillars is made up of people. And so our job as organizers, as people who care about the possibility of fighting for transformation, of rebuilding a different kind of infrastructure of change, can take action in ways that actually pull people away from those pillars. And so I've been really inspired over the last several months by federal workers who have refused to comply in small ways, whether that's when they received the email from Doge to report on 5 things that they did, that they would actually just spam that system with 5 random things from their day over and over and over again so that the inbox was so full that it kind of mucked up the works. You know, think about like scientists who run federal grants for whom a spectrum of gender is essential to their research, being told that gender has to be binary and how they report, that they just do it anyway, right? Like they just keep doing the research the way that they need to do it. Like each of those kinds of things I think are really inspiring kinds of actions because civil servants are a pillar of support for any kind of government system, right? Those folks didn't just do that randomly. Some people might have just felt moved to do it, but they do it because they're doing it together. They're doing it because they had access to some kind of training. And so I think that's another piece that has been inspiring for me lately, the work of a crew called the Freedom Trainers, which is organizing training on non-cooperation. And so this idea of kind of having the pillars of support in mind as we organize mass non-cooperation is important, whether that's thinking about, for example, the criminal legal system as a pillar of the governance system. One thing that we can do is join juries and acquit. So that's something called jury nullification. And we can do that on a mass scale. And we've seen that happen already in DC. I think a lot of people heard the story of Sandwich Guy, right? There was a guy who threw a sandwich at ICE agents and was arrested and tried to be charged for assault and all these kinds of things. But the grand jury in DC refused to indict. They didn't refuse to indict only on the facts, right? They refused to indict because this crew called Free DC has been training people in non-cooperation across the city for months now. And one of those tactics is jury nullification. There's all kinds of ways that we can do non-cooperation, whether that's tax resistance or boycotts or labor actions like strikes, civil servants, social non-cooperation, the World Cup coming to North America, the Olympics. Those are sites that we can remove our consent from, or we can be out of compliance with and disrupt, and that will have huge impact. And so the last one that I'll just name that I think is really important for people is this idea of building alternatives, like being part of mutual aid groups, which are not charity, they have a political and cultural purpose, or being part of cooperatives, whether economic cooperatives, solidarity economies, and those kinds of things. Those are both not complying with the current kind of pillars and giving people an opportunity to defect, to pull away from the current system and join something different that can become a pillar of the kind of society, of the kind of culture, of the kind of ways of being together that are actually reparative, that are actually pluralistic, that are actually loving, that can become the kind of infrastructure for making change that we need in our communities. And so I think that's how a lot of it fits together. You can see the threads of nonviolent action that pulls people towards us. You can see the threads of kind of doing that together, see the ways of actually having to be grounded and connected to ourselves and to each other. That becomes the fabric of the world that we need.
In my mind, I'm overlaying those two frameworks, the pillars and the spectrum of engagement. It's like
Mhm.
we are pulling people away from the pillars of power in order to hopefully topple them.
That's
And
right. That's right. And that pulling, I think, is really important, right? Because sometimes our actions actually push people closer to the center of
yeah,
that pillar. Sometimes our actions, in our anger, in our frustration, in our fear, all of which are super understandable, actually has the opposite effect of pushing people who might defect, who might pull away, pushes them closer. And so that's why I think it is important to be really clear about who our actual opponents are and to be really clear about whose work it is to do that. Like it's not necessarily my work to go fraternize with ICE agents right now. And it might be somebody in my community's work to do that.
yeah.
It's not necessarily my work to do some of these other kinds of activism that could pull people away from pillars, but it is my work to do some of it. And so I think that's another piece is to really figure out where each of our work is and being able to be with that question, showing up to different spaces with humility, with listening, without having to be the one with ideas all the time, but like being the one who's willing to move the chairs to help with setup or cleanup or those kinds of things. That's how we find our way into the kind of community organizations and formations and latent power that already exists in our communities that I think is really important for everybody to be on the lookout for finding ways to plug in right now.
Is there anything else that you would want people to know who are dealing with challenging people dynamics in their communities?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing is that I know some people are really struggling with what to do, like really feeling kind of frozen with what to do right now. And so I think to those folks who are feeling torn, who are feeling like you don't quite know which way is up, an important piece of the message is that there are some people who are not torn. There are some people who do have both moral clarity and strategic clarity about what to do. And those folks exist in your community. It's not only exist in your community, but they have been there for a long time and they've been advocating and organizing in small and large ways, whether it's the network of aunties that people call when harm happens in a community, or the community-based organization that's been pushing for protection for immigrants for a long time. Those formations exist. And so I think in those moments of like, gosh, I don't quite know what to do. I don't know how to respond to this thing. You don't actually have to respond every time. You can look to those groups that have that clear commitment to justice, clear commitment to liberation, clear commitment to collective freedom and dignity for answers. And then you can just show up, right? Like bring something, bring some water, and always, don't show up empty-handed, but also don't show up with my idea is the right idea. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the other piece, one thing that I had to learn in kind of a hard way, again, as a trained conflict worker, as a person who, master's degree in peace and conflict studies, right, is that we actually have to pick a side. That even in our kind of formation, sometimes there are conflicts that feel really intractable. We have to remember that we're on the side of justice, right? Like the impulse might be to be in the middle somewhere, but we have to remember that we've actually chosen the side of justice. We've actually chosen the side of liberation, the side of dignity. And so to really be grounded in that helps us have the kind of clarity of moving forward in hard and uncertain times. And then the last thing I'll just say is that we don't have to do this alone, right? Like we are in this with other people. And so I'm really grateful to my friends. This has been a really hard year for a lot of reasons. And I'm just so grateful to be surrounded by really wise, really compassionate, really dedicated people who have been part of leading change at really small levels. I have somebody that I can call if I'm feeling unclear, if I'm feeling devastated. And I feel really blessed to have friends who are doing really big work, who are changing the justice system, building community safety and restorative justice projects, who are facilitating massive coalitions right now, from Standing Rock to the movement for Black Lives and beyond, right? And so like to be able to just be connected to other people, I think is a hugely important piece of how to move through this time. I often hear people talk about lessons from the pandemic time. I think we can kind of ground back into that. Like, who are our people? Like, who are the people that show up for us when we need it? And who are the people that we feel like we can show up for? And I think grounding into that helps us to recognize that the world that we yearn for, the world that we're building towards, in many ways is already here. That's not to obscure the violence and the harm and the oppression that is very real and creeping ever closer to a lot of people and deeper in people's lives that's been there before. And there's so much resilience in that space. And so we don't have to live in the imagination of authoritarians, right? Like, because we can actually look at our communities and we can see the ways that communities are organizing to meet each other's needs. And then we build from there. That's that kind of action from a place of grounded grief. So, like I said, pick a side, be connected to people, know who your people are, and look for the folks who actually do have the moral and strategic clarity at this time, and then show up.
I'm trying to put a finger on the gift that I'm receiving. Just, I'm feeling a sense of awe and gratitude at all of the pieces that you were bringing together. The deep rooted emotional awareness and the strategic. Not a lot of people bring those two things. I'm just a lot of gratitude to you for doing the work that you're doing right now, especially everything that you've experienced personally this year and just how needed your work is. It's a real gift to know that you're out there doing this work.
Mhm. Thank you so much. I think it's really important for me to actually take that in, right? Like that's part of the practice too.
Yeah.
I think it's important for anybody who's doing the work of care and safety and transformation to actually receive that kind of gratitude. So that feels like a gift and I appreciate it from you. And I appreciate the opportunity to like work through and think about some of these things too. I think you're right. Like I think the activist world is often like, what's in front of me, let's do it, right? And then there's kind of like a personal growth type of world that's like, let me look inward and do my work on my cushion or do my work in one-on-one space and those kinds of things. And at the end of the day, we're complex whole beings that live in communities and are impacted by systems and have micro relationships with our people that are dear to us and those kinds of things. And so it has to all come together. And I appreciate hearing that reflection. And I think it makes me want to look for and lift up all the other examples as well of so many people, in that. And so I similarly appreciate you for kind of navigating these kinds of complexities in public right now. It's important to struggle and it's important to do that in public, and it's not easy to do that. I just really appreciate your willingness to be in the weave of what is and what is possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So how can people learn more from you?
You can follow the 22nd Century Initiative, 22ci.org. You can follow the Anti-Authoritarian Playbook on Substack, which is a regular blog by our executive director, Scott Nakagawa, with tips and insights for how to make sense of the moment that we're in, make sense of the times that we're in, insights from history and other contexts and that kind of thing. We have a particular project around ending political violence called Harnessing Our Power to End Political Violence. The website is endpoliticalviolence.org. You can find more resources, request training there. We have free training and coaching for groups that are organizing right now. So those are a few ways to stay connected and follow along. We'll share some other resources in the show notes, and there's some anti-authoritarian work happening where you live. So do a little bit of searching and find it if you haven't already. When we're in movement together, it's also with people that we don't know. And it's also with people that we don't know exactly what they're doing. And so to kind of lean in where you live, I think is really an effective way to feel like we are connected as well.
Thank you so much, Jiva. I'm really grateful for your time and your work.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining me. If you loved this conversation and want to hear more, I invite you to do three things. First, go to the Conflict Decoded show page wherever you listen to podcasts and tap the plus sign or click on follow. That way, you'll be the first to hear my new episodes and I will get to share them with you. Second, while you're there, if you would be willing to give the podcast a 5-star review or share it with a friend, I would be very grateful. And finally, if you are eager to receive the latest episodes by email, along with other morsels of guidance to support you and your work in the world, I invite you to subscribe to my Saturday Love Letters to Changemakers. To do this, visit callingsandcourage.com/subscribe. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take good care.